It's like we're de-risking through like thesis and belief, but we're not de-risking at a stage level. Like the stage risk is still the stage risk. Most people view capital as so far away from their reality in general. From a downtown New York perspective, right, which is a lot of creatives, the idea of raising venture money is still, like, I take a lot of conversations around like explaining venture to people, why they would even care to give you money. And then there's a lot of introductions and really looking through their materials and what they're doing. And you realize quite quickly how much further ahead they are than your typical like techie. Because when capital doesn't come into the picture of how they will build, they immediately get more thrifty, asking for favors, moving in just different ways. Where oftentimes when you see like an early stage pitch of someone who's aware of capital as their tool, and I fall into this category as well, I'm not throwing shade, it's just like, oh, the first thing I'm gonna do is like hire a team. I'm going to hire the labor that's going to make this reality. Versus I think when people don't view capital as a tool in general, that does not come into the picture. So what happens when that crowd of builder becomes aware of capital without diluting the muscle memory that they have on how to build is a really interesting question that we haven't really gotten to ask. And I think now with AI and the ability to sort of learn and produce code for a broadly non-technical class, you can actually have these folks who aren't classically trained in this way potentially produce venture scale outcome. Hollywood shouldn't be afraid of AI taking their job. Like, these platforms should be afraid of when this group of people can produce platforms for themselves because of AI. Just in anything that people are saying, oh, this new tool is going to take our jobs, just invert that to what happens when those people can create the platforms that they were previously subservient to. The craziest thing to me, Sam Altman was talking about how he thought that at first, labor would be the thing disrupted by AI. And, my dad was a union plumber in New York. So I knew off the rip that you're not replacing a plumber. That would just be so insanely hard to do versus just copy pasting GitHub into like the learning like data set and teaching something how to code, right? Like that's writing, that's text, that's actually insanely reproducible. I think now that veil has sort of been lifted or, that belief kind of shattered, you can kind of do that jujitsu move on all of these probes of, oh, they're going to use AI image gen to replace people that make posters. It's like, okay, let's say that is partially true. What happens when all those people can create the platforms that they desired in the first place for compensation of work because they're not reliant on someone up the coast of California to give them some equitable shakeout on like platform design? Well, I think they still have to get over the political hurdle, right? The fear hurdle. Like I think it's a political stance to be somewhat anti-AI for a set of creatives. I don't want to blanket all of them, but in a very similar way that it was a political hurdle and still is a political hurdle around crypto. Technologists, tech people don't know how to talk about themselves anymore. They sort of offload the talking to some of the worst people in the bunch. I think that there was a really big shift post, Steve Jobs dying, right? So Steve Jobs produced objects that you had to buy. And like any sort of consumer strong purchasing, the way that you spoke about yourself, akin to like a fashion brand, like you're setting a sort of lifestyle, right? And the businesses that took hold after that, that were not B2B focused, sort of live on the social media landscape, right? Which is essentially, this thing is free. That's all we really have to say. And then the mechanics of it sort of like speak for itself, right? It's like, how does Instagram talk about itself? Really doesn't have to, right? And because software is also so cheap and the switching costs are so low, they actually don't want to invest in how they talk about themselves, right? Whereas with hardware, you have to think about that entire packaging of how you're going to talk about yourself because it's part of the entire production structure. If we just keep following that line of software, it's kind of a software issue that people don't know how to talk about themselves. You know, that just kind of extends to crypto and AI. So now you get this new problem, right? Which is something I'm trying to write about right now, which is crypto is kind of like invisible hardware, right? It's like Ethereum virtual machine, all these mining rigs like distributed, but they don't know how to package it because no one has any singular ownership over it. You can't say like, I'm the voice of Bitcoin. People would shoot you down, right? And so the narratives that get spun are incredibly sort of like insular, and then you get sort of like the cult of crypto vibe, and then you get a pretty heavy misunderstanding outside of those boundaries, right? Very like imagined communities, Benedict Anderson. And then you kind of get hostility, right? So like identity through violence, McLuhan. So it's like the insular wants to maintain their identity, the external wants to attack that identity, and then you actually don't get the best understanding layer. And I think AI did a very similar thing, a very similar mistake, right? Which was Sam kind of went around being like, hey, this thing could all kill us, but we're gonna do it the best so you can trust us. And, you know, on like Bill Gurley, you know, regulatory capture, he kind of played that game. And now people are, you know, similar to crypto, shaking their head like, oh, why don't people like this? Why can't they see we're doing this good thing for them, you know? But also everyone became aware through Finch's social network that if you win in technology, you win big and you win powerfully. And that power is not a distributed power, despite a lot of general wealth distribution. But it's like Mark is still Mark, right? Jack is still Jack. And so I think people are aware that, you know, if Sam is right, then Sam is really powerful. And I think that also scares. I don't think it helps to like belittle those fears. But somehow, even with all the Steve haters during his time, which I think people always forget that there was like an anti-Steve crowd, he was still extremely beloved at the end of the day. I think it's a recognition of like, there was an object to be delivered. And the same way we have backlash on like the Humane review by MKBHD, and you know, I'm sure there's going to be an upcoming Rabbit review. There's a real seriousness to a physical object, right? That's why we feel really comfortable when we go into a store, like a clothing store, we don't buy anything. Software never really had to deal with that. And as a consequence, they never really had to deal with talking about themselves until they messed up, right? Hence like the Zuck apology tour or something like that. And yeah, I don't think that works anymore. The thing is, I understand like folks on Twitter say things like, investing in brand as a software company is, you know, it's a moot point. It's a money pit, right? Because you have to be so flexible. And what does that like? Can you make a brand that's that flexible? Question mark. And obviously at Eternal, Luca has been an absolute genius on how we navigate brand, whether that was through our show Exit Sign, whether that's through our visual language, even the way that, you know, I man like the customer support line, and even the way that we talk to kids over messages when they're having problems in the like new experience, you know, that he has such a high level of consideration as to how to do that version of Eternal that existed that was like high visual language. We have our own shows on TikTok and Instagram that are consistently going viral. We're IRL. We have like the line of kids rapping around the block through like collaborations. I don't think that should be a playbook, right? Like you and I have talked about this, like throughout the 2010s, there was the SaaS playbook. Like SaaS was so well known that you could literally reproduce it through a playbook. One that doesn't exist in consumer, and it definitely doesn't exist in brand. I think that from a software perspective, I find it really hard to like give folks advice there. I think from a hardware perspective, your brand is like the promise of the thing that's coming right behind it, right? And so that object promise has to be so in simpatico with the brand. The problem with like the Humane brand, right, is like it felt kind of like Baby Apple, very polished, very black and white. And it not all of their materials were that way when they're figuring it out, which is kind of what makes me sad. And then on top of that, it's like the TED Talk, the like standing in the lab to do the videos. It's like, what is the lifestyle behind this thing? I don't know. Whereas at least the Rabbit one just feels like, for better or worse, teenage engineering, which at least like there's only one teenage engineering. So like the second one is, maybe it's a good proposition, you know, and we'll see kind of what happens. But, you know, as a counterexample, like USB Club, I think is a really good sort of way to do extremely light, flexible brand, clearly definable to their community and rooted in the references of that community. But yeah, I mean, I think people just have to love like the references. I don't think tech people aren't fashion kids, right? They're not sitting down every weekend with all their reference books spread on the floor and like going to the store just to go to the store and try things on and not buy it. Like it's just a different culture. But I think it would behoove us as a community to really embrace that and to see like the values of it. I remember like there was this person online talking about how Bernard Arnault being the richest person in the world is like a tragedy or something compared to like Elon. Yeah, and I was just like, yeah, that's why you're still wearing skinny jeans right now, my guy. Like you don't get it. You know, they don't get it. And I think software brain, unfortunately, really loses that tangibility of what makes something desirable. It's about desire, and it's about when I achieve that desire, whether it's because I like sold things in my closet to get that thing, or I like saved up money, or I said YOLO and I just have credit card debt now. It's like when I have that on, it feels different. All culture is tech culture. We have a new type of software now, right? Like crypto is a new type of software. AI is a new type of software. Hardware is part of our nature environment layer. The next layer after that is culture, right? So then you have to say, okay, culture is downstream of nature and environment. If hardware is part of that, that means culture is downstream of hardware. Obviously, what's super downstream of that is like software culture is downstream of hardware. We've only had two dominant forms of software culture. We had web PC. PC was still decently niche up until the 90s with the internet. The internet is what made PCs a thing, period. And then you get mobile, right, with the iPhone. So now you get two software cultures, right? You have a third culture in video games and consoles, right? And that remains its own kingdom, right? It's kind of like the fact that like mushrooms are its own like animal kingdom. The thing about the hardware at that time is just kind of like, I don't think they could really bootstrap a new and interesting software culture, particularly when we just hadn't gotten all the juice out of web PC / mobile. Like mobile just had so far to go. Mobile still has far to go. But at that time, like the S curve, like we were still vertical on that innovation S curve, right? The chips going into the phones were getting stronger, which opened up more gaming on the phone, more rendering capacity, more like real-time capacity. So now that we've kind of gone over the lip, right, of the S curve on mobile, now I think there's an interesting place and time for new hardware. Apple still being quite strict about what's allowed onto the device and the ecosystem. You have even further capacity on the manufacturing side and more of an education on the manufacturing side, and people that have gone through the Apple system and the Google Pixel system and the Samsung system that know how to produce hardware. You have things like Raspberry Pi that creates a hobbyist environment around hardware, particularly on like the art installation side. Forefront, right? So you have like an emergent VR AR system. You had hits like Pokemon Go at Niantic, which although relied on the phone was still a different like modality with mobile AR. And then you just have a new generation that doesn't believe it should be like the old generation. And that's gonna be the true end result. Like, and again, like millennials kind of got shortchanged, right? They had to experience the come up and some of them got to contribute to it, but you weren't really gonna compete with that. You weren't going to compete with like maybe the most crystallized Steve vision of a computer in your pocket for the next 10 years, period. Sorry. When you take the S-curve, you take new software paradigms, you take a generation that just doesn't have to believe in the old generation, and you take still a quite capital-rich environment, and you take a generation that was kind of locked indoors with when all they had was their phone, and it probably drove them crazy and they don't even know how to process it. So it might get processed through building. I think it's a really different landscape potential. And that's like what I like to say. It's like it's a landscape potential. It doesn't mean it has to get realized. It's not inevitable that it will get realized. But I think that the ground is really fertile. And I think that it helps when you see, you know, like Humane just get like wrecked in a like YouTube review. Oh, some of the Apple people like don't necessarily have the answers. Like I think that's good, you know, because it actually reinforces like, oh, well maybe, yeah, Apple's a $2 trillion company, but they don't necessarily have the answers. Apple Vision Pro is definitely not an example of having the answers. That's for damn sure. I think it is just exciting. And I also think that for a generation that grew up with a lot of software and a slight intangibility to their lives, I don't think it's surprising that they want to work with materials. I think the best thing that could happen is that they work with materials, that they're sleeping on factory floors in Taiwan trying to get the, you know, manufacturing line right. I couldn't think of anything better, honestly. Yeah, well, I think there's still a little bit of fear, and like a valid fear of like, is this a use case Apple will just absolutely murder us on through some software update to their existing hardware? For example, plenty of people just keep their AirPods in all day, right? If I am making a pendant that listens to my conversation and then transcribes and has a really slick interface on mobile, what's stopping that from existing on like the AirPods side, right? Like what's stopping that from going listening mode and transcribing and being useful? I would say nothing, you know. Some of these early use cases are, you know, interesting. I think the thing about use case, right, it has to come back to a lifestyle and an image of a lifestyle that is quite attractive, even if it's hyper niche. The initial lifestyle imagery of like early computing is something I've been looking at a lot. It's pretty hackery, it's quite nerdy, kind of rooted in like a new American spirit of like, if you could think it, it can exist, right? Then it gets quite professional, right? Because they're thinking about like market expansion. So it's like VisiCalc and like, hey, you know those spreadsheets that you hate? It's better now. You know, that's kind of what it is. Like VisiCalc kind of accounts for a lot of computers being sold. Then they kind of go through a dry spell. It's like the devices are getting better, but the use cases, you know, people are writing software. Microsoft kind of is owning the entire use case. Again, still super, super professional. And then we get the internet, which really explodes. So then you kind of have to like sit back and you're like, okay, well, what is a use case today? And this is where the arguments around, you know, why isn't this just an app emerge. I really think like what people forget on like Medium and the message is if I'm an app, one, people won't care. And then two, I'm sitting next to a vending machine of competition, a brightly colored competition. So if I can siphon some function into its own device and it can break some threshold of purpose or daily usability, it creates a branch of a different future, right? So then I think the question becomes on use cases like, what is that initial kernel that I can kind of get up and going quite quickly? What I love about Humane is that they made a really conscious decision, which was, we are going to free your eyes and your hands. And that is a really beautiful sentiment. Like, I don't know if you've seen the like videos. They have like a video series where it's like kind of parents interacting with their kids. And the thing that's wonderful is that you see both hands sort of like in view in interaction. And that is a insanely, like, that's a stark contrast to what the phone does, which is the phone amputates, right? If I have a phone in this hand, I no longer have a right hand. And so between that and between this other piece, which Freddie and Zuris and I have talked about this like quite a bit. And Freddie was on the original iPhone design team, Design Slide to Unlock. And we were talking about, you know, the phone is Narcissus, right? It's constantly a reflection of myself, my interests, I'm important. And we talked about sort of, I wasn't around for this, but like 90s and early 2000s cell phone culture, right? Which is like, you had a cell phone if you were important. It's like, you have to be important for someone to even want to contact you while you're on the go. And the phone made everyone important, right? So then to create a device that looks outward at the world, to remove the Narcissus effect is quite shocking. And I think that people like to say they're not addicted to their phone, but one, we are, period. And two, when you challenge them on that, it's kind of like when like someone who swears they're not addicted to weed, if you tell them like, oh, maybe you should stop smoking, it's like, I need this, blah, blah, blah. It's like, whoa, you're acting a lot like someone addicted to weed, bud. And I think that it's quite similar with Humane and with our relationships to the phone. The phone is overpowered. It's overpowered, and there is no delineation between entertainment, work, relationship, what have you. And they want it that way because obviously that's, you know, capitalism. It's one of the downsides. You know, there's no incentive to break that model. So much interest today for new devices. It's like a sinner that knows they need to walk into church. Like, they know that they're sick, you know? They know that they are. But they just haven't found church yet. You know, they don't know where it is. And sometimes you got to walk 10 miles to find it, right? And so that, you know, that's just the thing of, you know, futures here is just not evenly distributed. So there's that nicheness. And then I would say there's the USB club nicheness, right? And that's a more cultural nicheness to begin, right? So for the uninitiated, USB club is a hardware paired file sharing network. So in DJ culture, you know, you utilize your USB to tap into the mixer and, you know, play your music, affect the room. But there's other sort of like technical cultures that utilize files in a very serious way. We're kind of a less file conscious society, you know, other than people losing photos and like Google Photos, they don't think about their files. But 3D designers, industrial designers, these folks really think about their files. Researchers think about their files. And so what's been really interesting on USB Club is just like seeing this daily activity of people file swapping paired to their hardware. And as you collect on the service, that's getting hard saved to your USB. And I hold 2 of my USB Club USBs on my keys. I always have them on me. I use them for DJing, and I use them, you know, to swap files and to share research. And that's a really vibrant culture. Now, it's niche because, one, DJing is niche. The idea of holding your USB on you all the time is niche. And then how many industrial designers you know, how many researchers you know. So it's niche from a communal aspect, but it's really rich. And the hardware allows for, I think in the future, like an economic enablement of a network like that will just kind of keep going. And then I think what AI is showing us is just sort of this focus on memory, you know? Like so much of like AI is kind of like, what's the memory of this model? What's the context window of this model? And I think as that gets more localized and you'll want that to interact with your things, where's your memory going to be? It's going to be on beautiful hardware, not just like your local Apple, MacBook or what have you. So I think USB Club has a really beautiful nicheness and a really beautiful broader vision of where they can go. Kind of like you mentioned, like from my inside out perspective, there's a few things cooking still, like NDA'd to the wazoo, that will kind of hopefully lean more into the nicheness, because I think there's a forgiveness in nicheness as well. Whereas I think, as we're seeing with Humane, like there's no forgiveness in general purpose. You either solve these needs or you don't. But I also think there needs to be a cultural shift, which I think is partially happening with the disillusionment around university, around what it means to work in manufacturing. Something that was really beautiful that I heard from friends who went to Taiwan and went to these factories is like, for a lot of, kids, they view that as like their summer internship, working in a factory. And you're not any more low class, because you work in a factory. And I don't think that's the American psyche. I think like if you work in a factory for a summer, you're kind of like, it's like, ooh. And I think that luckily there's a bit of a, universities are a scam, which, taken to the extreme, I think is unhealthy like anything else. But I do think kids are on a bit of a wave of being a carpenter, being a plumber, not too bad. I'm not wasting money on school. I'm not getting into insane debt. My grandpa did it. My grandma's cute. Like, seems like life will be fine. I'm fine. And so I think if that can continue, that's like true American dynamism right there. If we can get one Pegatron going in the US, there's obviously a lot of labor things that make that hard. But Tim Cook had an interview where they're saying like, oh, is it labor laws in the US? Is it like cost? And he's like, no, it's actually just skill. People in the US don't know how to do what they're doing over, at these manufacturing companies. And I think like anything else, like you can only do it if you do it. So I'm really interested in that, and in people that are thinking about kind of like fabrication. When I talk to founders about fundraising for hardware, there's kind of just a handful of folks that are really down and about it. Friends of the family, that are putting their money where their mouth is. But I would say a lot of hardware folks are pretty frustrated. They're quite frustrated. Much blood has been spilled over VC cowardice, but I think that the hardware folks are feeling it some of the most, and yet I think VCs are in this position where they don't know what to do, and so they're kind of just doing a lot of the same. Like, I mean, Sam said it. Like, he said OpenAI is going to steamroll these people building on OpenAI. So if the man himself who was on your side is telling you this, he's trying to save you money, or he's just trying to like scare away competition. I don't know what bigger of a sign these folks are waiting for. And I also, and then it makes you think about like, do they really understand what's happening? Do they really understand what is happening to software? I think founders just think differently about these things. And VCs seem to be doing well. They definitely have nicer houses and apartments than my studio, so they seem to be doing something better than me. Again, founders have a 50-yard view that always feels like it's 5 yards to them. And I think VCs are a bit more tempered than that. So for the past 15 years, right, like SaaS was the bread and butter, the playbook, right? And so, and they made a point of saying things like hardware is hard. So did it suddenly not get hard? We know that's not true, right? And so they would have to do a lot of unraveling of their own words, which they don't necessarily want to do, I think. And then, but at the same time, like they can't deny, like AI is a condensing force. It's just packs it all in, and it's going to collapse their favorite category. Like, it's already collapsing their favorite category. Everyone in their SaaS portfolio is doing AI something now, right? And so you either believe the base models are going to be the base models, and it's going to get super fractured at the application layer, right? Which, yeah, that's not a bad thesis, but I don't think they all believe that. But I don't think it necessarily pays for them to go into panic mode if they have to raise their next fund in 2 years. A lot of narrative breaks would have to happen. And so then you get the genuinely smart people who have been about this life for so long. I think about Michael Dempsey in this way. Like, I think if you look at the way he's written at Compound over the past 5, 6, 7 years, like, I don't think anyone, he has to be top 10 best positioned individuals that's managing a fund today. And the proof is in the pudding with investments like Runway, ML. And he saw that before anyone saw that. And he put his money where his mouth is. Similar to like wartime, peacetime CEOs, like I think VCs have had it quite easy. And it shows with how many funds were created, and it shows with like the ease of just sort of piling on to capital leaders. I think that's that, right? Because what is a fund supposed to do right now? You either become a crypto fund. A lot of people made their brand around not touching that. You become an AI expert all of a sudden. I think a lot of broad software people will just do that. You go into deep tech, right? Which you're really gonna have to remake yourself, right? Around the gundo, around the biosciences, like all those things, right? And, some of your LPs just might not wanna hear that from you. Or you actually, go kind of like VR, AR, right? You're like, hey, Vision Pro is out, a new app store needs to get filled. I'm gonna help fill that. That might be the easiest path for some of these people. But this is very much an outside-in look at investors, but they have more money than ever, and I think they've never been more lost, and I think that's an interesting relationship. I don't think anything really changes from the founder side. I think like if you win, you win. Your performance becomes sort of your bread and butter. You have the narrative or you don't. So yeah, I mean, whenever like my friends and I are talking about raising and things like that, it's always about like, what were your last 6 months and what are going to be your next 6 months? Like it doesn't get any more or less complicated than that. A lot of folks over the past year have, shut down and just given money back because they also don't know what's happening. I think founders are also kind of like, well, damn, do I become a GPT rapper? Am I really gonna stick it out in crypto? What is real? What is real? And this has been like a lot of conversation and writing that I've like put out around like quality of life. Like, are we here to improve quality of life or are we not? I think we've really lost some of that basic clarity. It's like we're building to improve quality of life. It's not like we're short of problems. So somehow, some way, we all see problems. What's cool about hardware is there's sort of like two camps. One is there's the camp that like genuinely needs to spend 4 years to get to a product that can be manufacturable. That it's akin to like running a research arm, and that takes a lot of capital. But the other side of it is sort of kind of the obbies and like the truffles where they shoestring budget, sell 1,000 pre-orders, hundreds of pre-orders, utilize that revenue to ship, right? And there's a little bit of there's a real putting your money where your mouth is thing there. Like, you really got to prove yourself. But I think it creates that sort of production to revenue relationship that is a little lost in software. It's a really clear J curve. But what's exciting is like you can really kind of like map. We got to sell this money at this price, and that's going to allow us to do the next batch and do the next batch of improvements. And that's something that software doesn't fully get to benefit from, because the scaling costs can be a little weird there. Where the joy of like hardware, right, is like if the first product's a hit, you can put in for the next batch, and that just comes at production costs. That doesn't even come at like new development costs. Folks are taking a much needed reset. I think, I think people, when they see available money, will always take the charge at available money. That's how the world is designed. This world is designed, And so I don't fault them for that. But I do think some of the more talented folks I know are really trying to think about like why. Past 6-7 years of being online and maturing and doing cool work, like if you did cool work online and you went like a little viral, like you could get a $3 million check. And if you had a small team, then you could last for years kind of just like experimenting. There's a lot of soul searching that happens. And then I also think people are seeing like, oh, being a founder there's a big difference between being a founder and working on like the really cool stuff. And I make this joke, like being a founder is like a scam. It's just like, you got to manage like, especially in the early stages, like I had to manage this like office lease and like the toilet broke and like this happened. And it's just like, and I'm like fielding like user issues coming through the hotline, and 2 of the engineers aren't like getting along, and this investor who wrote like the smallest check is also my biggest headache, and my girlfriend doesn't like me. It's just like, all of that is happening at the same time that you're seeing the environment around you move at a pace that never feels like you're moving at. And that is a real like psychic trip. You never feel like you're moving fast, period. It never feels like that. It always feels like you're going really slow. But comparison's the thief of joy. So you gotta have your mantras.